It is I, Lady Hexerai, once again, to bring you the good news about witchcraft. Today we'll explore the second chapter of the book Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, by Philosopher Sylvia Federici. In this video, we'll explore division between productive labor and reproductive labor, the domestication of women, and the patriarchy of the wage. During the transition, the most common riots were over food, and women, like myself, were at the forefront across the continent. And because of this, the government didn't take much time discarding the earlier so-called status and privilege granted to women and started their persecution. It was far more difficult for them to become meaningless beggars and vagabonds. All they did was to stand against the system, and they suffered the most for it. The collapse of feudalism opened up markets and created a production for market economy. Wage labor divided production from the reproduction of the species. Without a doubt, normalization of wage labor was guided by the patriarchy. Sister Federici goes to great pains to write the history of the patriarchy of the wage, a history which has long been forgotten or even erased, even by warlocks like Karl Marx. Proletarian women found it increasingly difficult to get work. Only the lowest forms of work were permitted women. Nearly a third of the female workforce in Europe were domestic servants. Other vocations included farmhands, spinners, knitters, embroiderers, hawkers, wet nurses. In the law, in tax records, and in the hiring practices of the remaining guilds, women should not work outside the home. Their reproductive work wasn't even considered real work, and was useless in relation to the market. Even if women created clothes for the market, it was still considered domestic work. But when men did the same thing, it was considered productive. The extent that women were allowed to work outside the home, it was either reproductive work for the benefit of the wealthy, or productive work for the benefit of their husbands. In many places, from Austria to England, women working side by side with their husbands, creating the same products, received no wage. Their husbands were legally entitled to their wives' wages. Sister Federici says, quote, "This policy, making it impossible for women to have money of their own, created the material conditions for their subjection to men, and the appropriation of their labor by male workers. It is in this sense that I speak of the patriarchy of the wage. We must also rethink the concept of wage slavery. If it is true that male workers became only formally free under the new wage labor regime, the group of workers who, in the transition to capitalism, most approached the condition of slaves was working-class women, like myself. This devaluation created a more prominent sexual division of labor. It led to the creation by the 19th century of the full-time housewife, and redefined women's relationships to men. So, women went through double degradation in the transition to capitalism compared to men. Quote, "In this sense, the destiny of European women in the period of primitive accumulation was similar to that of female slaves in the American colonial plantation, who, especially after the end of the slave trade in 1807, were forced by their masters to become breeders of new workers." So this patriarchy of the wage created a system of exploitation where even 2-year-olds could apply for the factory. Women and children's labor were bought cheap. The femininity of women started being redefined, and efforts were made to tame them, so that they could serve as better instruments in this reproduction of the labor force. Women lost their rights to represent themselves and to have any kind of political say because of the devaluation of their labor meant the devaluation of their gender. It also reshaped the male and female relationship. Quote, "The sexual division of labor that emerged not only fixed women to reproductive work, but increased their dependence on men, enabling the state and employers to use the male wage as a means to command women's labor. In this way, the separation of commodity production from the reproduction of labor power also made possible the development of a specifically capitalist use of the wage, and of the markets as a mean for accumulation of unpaid labor." Federici's contention, contra Marx, is that the alienation of the worker from their own labor and land grabs, while necessary, were not in themselves sufficient to guarantee capitalism's ultimate success. No. Only the enormous unpaid reproductive labor of women could provide sufficient fuel for the fires of capitalist primitive accumulation. Mercantilism didn't just need absolute control over productive labor. No, it also needed complete control over the reproduction of the species. The best people for that is women, like myself. Though hashtag not all women and hashtag trans men exist. Mercantilism was population obsessed, even fetishistic, if I dare say. You see, the transition to capitalism created a population crisis hitherto unseen. Europeans exported death to the Americas. The American Holocaust killed 95% of the population in South America in a mere century after the Spanish Conquista. The Mexican population went from 11 million in 1519 to 2.5 million in 1600. It was this Holocaust which necessitated the exportation of indentured servants to the Americas and Australia. And when even that failed to meet production demands, the mid-Atlantic slave trade developed. The population was also declining throughout Europe. While not as drastic as the Black Death a few centuries prior, so desperate for workers were the mercantilist class and state that entire new fields of study around population developed, creating a biopower regime. This term biopower comes from our warlock friend Michel Foucault. Sister Federici defines it in a note as: biopower expresses the growing concern at the state level for the sanitary, sexual, and penal control of individual bodies, as well as population growth and population movements, and their insertion into the economic realm. This may come off as surprising. Certainly, most civilizations have performed censuses, which is true, but this was mainly done as a way to collect taxes. It was a negative power which took something from the population for the benefit of the state. Yet the study of demographics which emerged in the transition was very different. It was positive. It wanted to know as much as it could about the population, not only to control it, but to apply that knowledge to the numerous fields of inquiry from medicine to industry, in order to create more life and extend life longer. Knowledge is power, you have no doubt heard. And it is no different here either. Theorists did not just sit in their ivory towers and castles, fetishizing over demographic data. No! They put it to work. Women, like myself, increasingly excluded from the wage and enclosed in the home, had one job: make babies. It is during this time that we see the criminalization of contraception, abortion, infanticide, and non-procreative sex. Which is the best kind of sex in my opinion. No anal, no oral, no buggery, no harpsichord playing. What a dreary time to be alive. But that's not all. In many places, women had to register their pregnancies with the local authorities. If an unregistered pregnancy ended in miscarriage, as is very common, the punishment against the woman was severe, up to death even. Many midwives were banished from the birthing process, branded witches who used dark satanic magic. This removed control over reproduction out of women, like myself, hands. We lost control over our own reproductive function. Men forced their way into the birthing chambers and prioritized the life of the unborn over the life of the woman. Women were enslaved to procreation. What had been previously a private affair became public, controlled by men and the state. At the same time, in many places, rape was decriminalized. Often, penniless lords raped women and girls, leaving them with little recourse to punish or prevent these violations. Quote, according to this new social sexual contract, proletarian women became for male workers the substitute for the land lost to the enclosures, their most basic means of reproduction, and a communal anyone could appropriate and use at will. In the new organization of work, every woman, other than those privatized by bourgeois men, became a communal good. For once women's activities were defined as non-work, women's labor began to appear as a natural resource, available to all, no less than the air we breathe or the water we drink. This is significant. Under mercantilism, women were as much of a resource to men and capital as men were to capital. Though, to be clear, our work is much more valuable. I, Lady Hexerai, will see all you lovely people in the next video. Bye.
Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon.